So welcome to our first question and answer session for the remote section of the class. So trying to answer 5 or 6 of the questions that were asked in the email. Most of the questions were really good, so appreciate that. So we'll try to do this each week. A couple of the questions dealt with material that will be coming in next week's snippets, budgetary issues late in the Carter administration, and Carter and Iran. So here goes. Several questions that dealt with this slide, to the effect of how is it that we had these 4 leading Democrats all drop out, and which is a really good question. So the basic answer here is that 1976 is kind of the last year with this with the pre-modern nominating system, where everyone assumed that it was going to pick up with New Hampshire, and so they could kind of sweep into the race in New Hampshire and then win. And Carter outthought them all, spent a lot of time in Iowa, which had moved its caucuses before New Hampshire, and by doing well in Iowa, that gave him momentum into New Hampshire. Humphrey, Muskie, and McGovern never declared their candidacies in 1976. They were basically waiting to see how the political world would kind of play out. 1975, all 3 of these guys, remember, were in the Senate. In 1975, there were lots of big things going on in the Senate, the end of the Vietnam War, how to address inflation. It's a very important investigation of the CIA. And so they were focused more on their legislative activities rather than their political activities, and they assumed they had more time than they did, and were basically caught off guard by Carter's triumph. In the end, this winds up killing the Democratic Party, because Carter really didn't have lots of strong support from institutional Democrats. He had basically just parked himself in Iowa for 2 years, won this upset victory there, and parlayed that momentum to winning New Hampshire. And then once he won New Hampshire, Humphrey, McGovern, and Muskie at that point said they weren't going to run, and that left Carter going up against a kind of weak field where he was able to sort of skate through and get to the nomination. The one lesson that candidates take from Carter's victory is that you can't do what McGovern, Muskie, and Humphrey did in 76. That is, that you can't wait to run, that you have to get into the presidential race earlier and earlier. So, 5 days after whoever wins the election this November, the other party will already have candidates who are thinking about staying in the race, and it's the Carter model that is the example here. Second question. Let's go to that. A couple of questions, one from Joe, one from Isabella, that dealt with Carter's malaise speech, what his intentions were, why it had the effects that it did. Again, he never uses the word malaise in the speech, so it's kind of odd. And I think there are a couple of things here. The first is this is the track of Carter's approval rating during his presidency. And basically, you can see a pretty much straight downward line, except for that one spike in 1980. That's right after the taking of the hostages, where this kind of burst of support for Carter, which is very short-lived. So in effect, he was a president whose popularity was waning throughout. And what killed him with the malaise speech was not necessarily the speech itself, because the text of the speech was in some ways unobjectionable. But a few days later, when he fired several cabinet officers, and that created an image of both panic and a sense that he was out of his league as president, which was in some ways not an incorrect assumption. So it was the combination of the speech and the precipitous decision to fire the cabinet officials. In terms of what Carter was hoping, what was it an attempt to rally Americans under him, or was it simply an attempt to say something at all about the issue? It does seem like it was an attempt to rally. He thought a lot about the speech. He crafted the themes of the speech himself. There certainly are presidents who from time to time have been able to shift public opinion through their oratory, at least in the short term. JFK, FDR earlier than that, Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s, Barack Obama in the 2008 campaign, and at various points throughout his presidency, even on brief occasions, Clinton and W. Bush. Carter, as you saw from that clip, that Carter was not a gifted orator, and this was in some ways a kind of desperation move. He wasn't able to push his energy package through Congress, so the hope here was to appeal to the people, to rally them, and that they would put pressure on Congress to act. That almost never works, and it certainly wasn't going to work in this case in the way that Carter framed the issue of basically, we all need to improve our moral standing and this kind of thing. It was a speech that illustrated Carter's political weakness. The next question, which was from Miriam, dealt with the issue of the seniority system. And remember from the first snippet last time, I talked about how there was this big change in terms of the House Democrats ran their approach, where the traditional approach had been the seniority system, that is the most senior member of the committee became the committee chair, and they replaced it with a vote of all Democrats to decide who would be the committee chair. And that traces to a revolt against this man with the large cigar, Speaker Joe Cannon, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives in the early 20th century, first decade of the 20th century. And Cannon's approach was to maximize the power of the Speaker and to allow the Speaker to appoint committee chairs and committee members. And basically then if you got on the bad side of the Speaker, you would find yourself removed from your committee slot. He was an autocratic leader. And in 1909, there was what was called a revolt against him. He was a fairly conservative Republican that was orchestrated by a coalition of Democrats and left-wing Republicans in the House that succeeded in removing him as Speaker and rewriting the rules. And in the aftermath of that revolt, as a way of minimizing the power of the Speaker, the House changed its rules to a seniority system. And so that way the chair would not be designated by the Speaker, it would be designated by whoever happened to be around in the committee that long. And so for roughly 65 years, the House uses that system. I mean, we can see obvious problems with that system. You don't need to be a genius here. If you're using a system where it's just longevity, you can get someone who was in their late 70s or early 80s, or even in the case of Strom Thurmond in the Senate in his 90s at one point, who really are past their prime and shouldn't be committee chairs. Being a chair of a congressional committee is a difficult job, even in temperate times. But the seniority system itself and the way the House used it dated from this revolt against Cannon, and the idea here was to limit the power of the Speaker. We now have moved towards a system that is very similar to the Cannon-like system. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, if she wants, can remove committee chairs. She did so the last time she was Speaker. Newt Gingrich, who becomes Speaker in the 1990s as a Republican, takes a similar approach. So the power in Congress has moved back towards the leaders and away from the sort of the committee chairs. The irony is that these reformers in the 1970s didn't anticipate that occurring at all. They thought that removing the seniority system would diffuse power and make younger members more influential. The next question came from Anna, which she was asking about the aftermath of Roe versus Wade and whether any Democrats came out in favor of abortion rights. And the answer to that is yes and no. Pre-Roe, both Democrats and Republicans had pro-choice and pro-life members. The abortion rights movement legally begins only in the mid-60s in state laws in New York State and in California, where where the governors sign abortion rights laws. The governor who signed the California law is a name that some of you may remember, Ronald Reagan. It's a reminder that the issue wasn't as polarized then. The aftermath of Roe, the problem for the Democrats, as you can see on this map, Catholics tended to be overwhelmingly Democratic, dating from the early 20th century, continuing on through the 1970s. But there are changes within the Catholic Church in terms of ideas in the 1970s. Conservative Pope John Paul II will come in later in the decade. And so there are a lot of Catholic Democrats who are alienated by Roe and by what they see as the Democrats' insufficient standing up to the Supreme Court on Roe. And there were lots of reasons why the Democrats chose to accept Roe, but the primary one was the Democrats believed, not unreasonably, that if they attacked the Supreme Court's authority on Roe, that could be used by opponents of civil rights to say maybe the Supreme Court isn't right on civil rights issues as well. And so in a number of these areas, especially in the upper Midwest, a lot of Catholics moved from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party as a result of Roe. So the short-term political effects of Roe, and I'll be talking a little bit about this more next in the next batch of snippets, was to benefit the Republicans. The next question, which came from Victor, asked whether gay people were still considered a national security risk in the 1970s, or was popular straight opposition to gay rights-based moral and religious sentiments. The answer to that is yes. Under the law, they were still considered a security risk, and they will be so until the 1990s. This is a New York Times clip from 1995 when President Clinton ended the ban on security clearance for gay workers. The 1990s are the first time, at least nominally, that gay and lesbian soldiers can serve openly. This is don't ask, don't tell. We'll get to that when we get to the 1990s. Although ironically, if you were a gay soldier, you had a lesser chance of being kicked out of service in the 1980s under Reagan than in the 1990s under Clinton. But these 1950s ideas, pre-religious right, of gay people as a security risk remain in existence under the law through the 1990s, even though these policies were very sporadically enforced. And then the last question, which came from Hamza, asked that aside from LGBT rights, what are the consequences of not having passed the ERA, and why hasn't the ERA been passed yet? Advocates of the ERA would say that it has been passed, that it was passed in January, when Virginia became the 38th state to ratify approval of the ERA. There are, however, two problems with that line of argument. The first is that the ERA Authorization Act said that the authorizations had to occur within 10 years. That is, they had to occur by 1982. And Illinois, Virginia, and Nevada just authorized the ERA in the past year. The second is that these 5 states that I have on the chart have withdrawn their ratifications, largely as a result of pressure from social conservatives. And so if you're going to make an argument that Virginia, Illinois, and Nevada should count for ratifying after the deadline, then logically you have to assume that these 5 states also could withdraw their ratifications after the deadline, which means there are only 33 states that have ratified. And this may work its way up to the Supreme Court, but Justice Ginsburg gave an interview earlier this year saying that she saw no merit to the argument that these ratifications actually would be binding. In terms of what the consequences were if it would have been passed, in retrospect, the key consequences would have been for LGBT rights, because it would have been an alternative vehicle for gay and lesbian activists to use to push for legal decisions on equality. But in terms of women's rights, probably the biggest issue in the 1980s and 90s, because again, abortion had been codified as a result of Roe, likely would have been equal pay and sexual harassment issues, where the feminist movement had to move piecemeal through obtaining court rulings, obtaining new pieces of legislation. With an ERA in place, they might have been able to get everything at once. So that's the responses to a handful of questions. They were very good. I'll ask for additional questions in this kind of format each time we move through our snippets to kind of do whatever we can to recreate a classroom atmosphere. So stay safe, and I'll talk to everyone soon.